It was on a quiet evening at Fort Belvedere, the retreat where the Prince of Wales found his moments of escape, that Lady Thelma Furness was seen stepping from the polished motor car, her figure poised against the dimming sky. The lamps along the drive burned softly, and the air smelled of damp earth after rain. The prince, waiting restlessly within, rose at once, for this American woman with the deep eyes and a manner both confident and tender had come to soothe his ever-roaming heart. It was in such hours, half private, half whispered about in courtly circles, that the story of Thelma entwined itself with the destiny of the heir to the British throne. Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet unfolding of the past. Before we begin, I invite you to pause for a moment and share in the great thread of memory. Write in the comments when and where you are listening so that we may together weave a global tapestry of time and place. And if you wish this channel to continue its telling of stories long preserved, please do remember to subscribe. Let us step, slowly and without haste, into the life of Lady Thelma Furness, the woman who lived in the shadows of both glamour and heartbreak before Wallis Simpson claimed the world's attention. The story begins in Cincinnati in the year 1904, when two cries broke the stillness of a summer night. Twin daughters were born to Harry Hayes Morgan and his wife Laura, Delphine Kilpatrick, children who would carry in their veins the restless energies of America and the aspirations of old Europe. Thelma, the quieter twin, and Gloria, the more tempestuous, opened their eyes to a household already defined by both privilege and instability. Their father was a man of business, tied to the world of banking and ventures across oceans, yet never wholly secure, his fortunes rising and falling with the tides of speculation. Their mother carried within her a strain of Southern elegance, refined and ambitious, whispering of salons and drawing rooms far from Ohio's industrious heart. One imagines the nursery in those early days, pale wallpaper patterned with faded flowers, the scent of linen warmed by summer sun, the rhythm of footsteps on wooden floors as nurses came and went. Thelma and Gloria, bound by birth, lay side by side, their small faces mirrors of each other, yet destined to diverge into very different fates. Twins are often seen as two parts of a single whole, yet perhaps they are also reminders that life is shaped by delicate accidents, by choices and encounters that tilt one path toward renown and another toward obscurity. Did Thelma, even as a child, sense her place as the quieter flame beside a brighter, more unruly fire? We cannot know, yet the impression lingers that her role was always to stand just within the shadow of another's brilliance, until she too found a light of her own in unexpected company. The city around them was a place of transition, where the wealth of industry mingled with the old manners of families who sought to preserve dignity in an age of restless growth. Streetcars clattered over rails, the smoke of factories drifted into blue skies, and in parlors with heavy draperies, people spoke of Europe with longing, as though refinement could only be borrowed from across the Atlantic. In such an atmosphere, the Morgan sisters were reared not for toil, but for appearances, for the cultivation of charm, and for the art of belonging in rooms where decisions were made, not with hammers or tools, but with voices and glances. Thelma was not the louder of the two. She grew into a girl whose beauty was remarked upon for its serenity rather than its fire. She had dark eyes that seemed to rest gently upon others, a figure slim and poised, and an instinctive grace that made her presence felt even when she was silent. There is a kind of power in such quietness, though it is often overlooked until it has already altered the course of an evening. In contrast, her sister Gloria was radiant, impulsive, and destined to scandal. Already as girls, the difference between them became a theme, whispered by relatives, as though fate had chosen to craft a pair of living comparisons. Yet their childhood was not without its uncertainties. The family moved often, carried by the winds of business ventures. Homes were established and abandoned, schoolrooms filled with new teachers, friendships begun only to be broken again. Such movements gave the sisters both a sense of adventure and a lack of rootedness. They became accustomed to the shifting of walls, to new cities, to ships that cut across the Atlantic, and to the endless rearrangement of the furniture of life. Thelma learned to carry herself with composure in each new setting, as if stability could be created within her rather than found around her. One can imagine the summers of her girlhood, the sound of cicadas in the trees, the warmth of porches where her mother read aloud letters from relatives, the distant call of trains in the night. Against these soft, ordinary backdrops, the seeds of extraordinary destinies were quietly planted. For it was not only beauty that Thelma inherited, but also a restless openness to the larger world, a sense that her life would not remain bound to the streets of Cincinnati. The family's eyes were often fixed on Europe, and Europe in turn would one day open its doors to her in both welcome and suspicion. The Morgan name did not belong to the very highest circles of New York or London, yet it was close enough to them to dream of entry. The twins grew under the influence of their mother's ambitions and the atmosphere of a nation that celebrated both wealth and daring. Their lineage carried traces of Southern honor, of financial enterprise, and of adventurous bloodlines that reached back to generals and frontiers. For Thelma, such heritage became less a foundation than a stage from which she could leap when the time was right. As the girls approached adolescence, they were sent to schools where refinement was taught with the same seriousness as arithmetic. Thelma absorbed the lessons of posture, of careful speech, of the art of listening without giving too much away. In such disciplines, she excelled, not because she forced herself to learn, but because they matched her natural inclination toward composure. She was not the sort to seek the center of the room, yet she was the one to whom eyes would eventually turn, drawn by the subtle gravity of someone who seemed at once accessible and untouchable. In the evenings, when lamps glowed dimly against high ceilings, she would sometimes sit apart, sketching or reading, while Gloria pursued laughter and daring games. Was there already a sense of destiny dividing them, as though one would be remembered for brilliance and controversy, and the other for the quieter tragedy of being displaced by history itself? The image lingers. Two young women alike in appearance, yet already separating in the unseen currents of fate. By the time Thelma reached her late teens, she'd become aware of her beauty and its effect. Suitors hovered, introductions were made, and society pages began to mention her name alongside her sisters. Yet for Thelma, the meaning of such attention was ambiguous. Was it a promise of love, or merely a recognition of her role in the performance expected of women of her station? The lines were blurred, and she stepped across them with the grace of someone not yet certain whether she was acting in her own story or in one that had been scripted long before her birth. The house in which she was born no longer stands, the nursery long vanished, the windows broken and gone. Yet one might imagine the flame of a single candle, trembling in the draught of a summer night, casting twin shadows upon the wall, two figures side by side, uncertain which will grow larger, which will fade, and which will one day leave the other behind. That small, flickering light becomes our final image here, and it will lead us gently onward into the contradictions and wanderings of Thelma's childhood. The candle flame still flickers in the nursery window, trembling against the soft current of night air. That same flame, fragile yet persistent, seems to follow us into the years of Thelma's childhood, a reminder that brightness can endure within instability. For though she and her twin were born into privilege, they were also born into a life marked by constant movement, by contrasts that left no place entirely secure. Their father, Harry Hayes Morgan, had the carriage and confidence of a man who belonged in the drawing rooms of New York, or the bustling salons of Paris. Yet his fortunes wavered with each venture, and his daughters often found themselves in settings more uncertain than their lineage might suggest. Their mother, Laura Delphine Kilpatrick, carried a Southern elegance and the echo of military honor in her blood, for she was the daughter of General Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, remembered with both admiration and controversy for his service during the Civil War. Thelma thus grew with the strange knowledge that her ancestry combined the battlefield and the ballroom, the world of daring campaigns and the world of whispered refinements. Perhaps it was from this union of opposites that her own poise was shaped, balancing quiet endurance with flashes of boldness when the hour demanded. The home of her earliest years was one of many thresholds. At times, the sisters resided in Cincinnati, at other times in New York, and still other times were spent abroad. Each place left its own mark. In America, there was the sense of modernity, of streets filled with new inventions, of a society eager to rise, of voices proclaiming that the future belonged to those who dared to seize it. In Europe, there lingered the perfume of centuries, the weight of traditions, the delicate codes of class and conduct that seemed immovable even as the old empires shifted after the Great War. The twins grew accustomed to stepping between these worlds, learning to change their speech, their posture, their very rhythm of being, depending on which shore they found themselves upon. What must it have been like for two girls so young to be taught that identity itself was pliable, that belonging required the art of constant adaptation? Did Thelma already begin to feel that her true self might be hidden beneath layers of manner, costume, and expectation, as though she were a figure painted over with shifting colors, never quite her own? The voyages across the Atlantic were themselves lessons in contrast. The great liners with their polished decks and echoing dining rooms were like floating palaces. The air carried both the salt of the sea and the scent of perfumes mingled with tobacco smoke. Thelma and Gloria would walk the promenades, dressed in small coats and hats, while adults around them spoke of fortunes and politics. The sea was both an adventure and a divider, a space in which one identity could be shed and another assumed upon arrival. One imagines the sisters leaning together against the railing, the wind in their hair, the gulls trailing above the waves, listening to the low hum of engines that drove them from one destiny to another. In New York, the Morgans were not among the very highest of the city's social hierarchy, yet they were close enough to brush against it, to attend gatherings, to feel the pull of that glittering circle. The girls were taught by tutors, and at schools where discipline was rigorous, yet always tempered by the expectation that their futures lay not in professions, but in alliances. At times, their father's ventures faltered, and there were whispers of diminished circumstances, yet their mother's ambitions pressed them forward, urging them always to maintain appearances. Thelma, who even as a child bore a serene expression, absorbed these lessons quietly, as though storing them away for later use. She was not the sister who drew notice through mischief or defiance, but the one who seemed composed, even when uncertainty loomed. That quality, unnoticed perhaps in childhood, would later prove magnetic in rooms filled with men who yearned for stability, yet craved the freshness of American vitality. And yet, within the walls of their shifting homes, contradictions flourished. The sisters were indulged with fine clothing, with glimpses of theaters and salons, with stories of Europe told in hushed admiration. At the same time, they felt the unease of a family never fully anchored, a sense that each comfort could be taken away as quickly as it appeared. Such a life breeds both confidence and insecurity. Thelma grew into the habit of presenting herself as though she belonged, even when belonging was not assured. There is power in that performance, though it comes at the cost of always wondering if the mask has become the face itself. The presence of her twin, Gloria, sharpened these contrasts. Gloria, who would one day draw the full glare of scandal in the custody battle for her daughter, was as impulsive and fiery as Thelma was contained. Together they were admired, two young women of striking beauty, yet their temperaments marked them as foils. In the games of childhood, it was often Gloria who pushed boundaries, who demanded attention, while Thelma lingered slightly behind, watching, absorbing, learning the patterns of others. But is it always the one who stands slightly behind who learns most deeply? There is a peculiar wisdom in quiet observation, and it may be that Thelma, though overlooked, was already gathering the skills that would allow her to hold the attention of a prince. As adolescence arrived, their education took them farther afield. There were seasons in Europe where they were exposed to languages, to art, to manners as old as the stones of the cities they walked through. Thelma's taste refined itself in these surroundings, her eye trained to notice the subtleties of dress, of gesture, of tone. Such awareness would later allow her to move through London's elite circles with an ease that belied her origins. Yet it also deepened her contradictions. For how does one reconcile the straightforward energy of America with the heavy inheritance of Europe? Thelma would spend much of her life navigating that very question, her identity never fixed entirely in either world, but instead hovering between them like the ships that carried her back and forth. And then there were the moments of solitude. It is easy to imagine her as a girl of 13 or 14, sitting by a window with a book, while outside, carriages rolled or automobiles rattled down new paved streets. The world was changing quickly. Women were demanding votes. Fashions were shortening. Wars had unsettled old certainties. Did she feel herself a part of that tide, or merely a spectator, watching history sweep past her? She could not have known then that her own life would one day be woven into the very fabric of monarchy and scandal, that her name would echo faintly in the story of an empire's heir who chose love over crown. The contradictions of her childhood were not easily resolved. Wealth without security, privilege without complete acceptance, beauty without a clear destiny, all these shaped her youth. And yet, in that shaping, perhaps there was also strength. For when one is taught early that nothing is fixed, one learns to adapt, to reinvent, to step lightly into new roles without hesitation. Thelma carried this adaptability with her into adulthood, and it would serve her well, though it also left her vulnerable to being replaced when others adapted faster or more ruthlessly. The image that lingers from these years is not one of grandeur, but of movement. Trunks packed and unpacked, steamships departing with long, trailing ribbons, the sound of footsteps echoing in unfamiliar hallways, the faces of new acquaintances quickly replaced by others. Thelma's youth was a tapestry of departures and arrivals, of rooms entered and abandoned, of beginnings that never found full roots. Perhaps this is why, in later life, she clung so fiercely to moments of intimacy, for constancy had been denied her from the start. And so we leave her here, standing on the deck of yet another ship, the salt wind whipping against her face, her twin at her side, both gazing toward a horizon that promised adventure, but not certainty. The ocean stretches vast and unbroken, and the gulls circle restlessly above. It is in this restless crossing that Thelma's story continues, carrying her toward the first of her great entanglements with wealth, love, and the fragile illusions of permanence. The gulls circle above the restless sea, their wings flashing white against the expanse of gray sky. They follow the ship as though reluctant to let the sisters slip too far from the shores they leave behind. Thelma, her coat pulled close against the salt wind, gazes outward not with the impatient thrill of her twin, but with a calmness that seems to anticipate rather than rush. Each voyage, each crossing, is a reminder that new beginnings may rise on any shore. And it was not long before one such beginning appeared, clothed in the form of marriage that most expected of destinies for women of her circle, yet carrying within it the uncertainties that would become a theme in her life. In 1922, at the age of 18, Thelma was introduced to James Vale Converse, heir to an industrial fortune. The Converse family was bound to the world of steel and enterprise, their wealth carved from the bones of industry that defined America's rise. James was older than Thelma, a man of means and expectation, and his courtship was swift. Thelma, graceful and compliant, entered into the engagement as though stepping onto a path set before her since childhood. Marriage was the natural conclusion to a girlhood of refinement, the stage upon which beauty and composure were expected to perform. Yet within that seeming inevitability lay the fragility of lives joined more by arrangement and ambition than by a shared flame of spirit. Their wedding, like many of the age, was attended by the sparkle of society. Gowns rustled in candlelit halls, the scent of roses filled the air, and toasts were offered in the polished tones of men accustomed to prosperity. Thelma, still not yet 20, wore her new role with serenity, her beauty radiant, her demeanor calm. Yet beneath the shimmer of diamonds and the clinking of crystal glasses, one wonders whether she felt the strange stillness of stepping into a script already written by others. For though she was admired, adored even, it was not adoration of her essence, but of what she represented: youth, beauty, the promise of a dynastic alliance. Was there room within such roles for her own desires, or was she merely a figure cast into the play of wealth and social expectation? In the early days of the marriage, Thelma lived among the trappings of affluence: country houses, polished automobiles, weekends spent among others of their circle. The pace of life was brisk yet empty, filled with engagements that dazzled but rarely satisfied. James Converse, though wealthy, carried with him the weight of industry's demands and the restlessness of a man who sought to command rather than to nurture. Thelma, sensitive yet poised, adapted as she always had. She smiled where smiles were expected. She charmed in the way Americans were admired for their freshness among more restrained Europeans. And she filled her days with the motions of a wife who belonged to the surface of glittering gatherings. But behind the doors closed to society's eyes, there was unease. Thelma, still more girl than woman, carried a longing that was not answered by her husband's attention. Their lives, though bound legally, moved in parallel rather than entwined. It is said that wealth smooths the roughness of life, but in truth it often amplifies the distance between two hearts. The grander the halls, the greater the echo of loneliness within them. For Thelma, who had always adapted, who had always shifted herself to fit new rooms and expectations, the silence of her own desires began to grow louder. The marriage did not endure. By the mid-1920s, whispers of strain had begun to circulate, and in 1925, Thelma and James divorced. For society, it was another entry in the long ledger of alliances made and broken, for such things were hardly rare among the privileged. Yet for Thelma, it marked the first true rupture in her personal story. She had entered adulthood by way of marriage, and now, scarcely into her 20s, she stood alone again, marked by the ambiguous identity of a divorcee. In those years, divorce carried both scandal and fascination. Women who stepped away from marriages were seen as daring, even reckless, yet also increasingly admired for the independence such acts suggested. How did Thelma carry this change? Not with despair, but with the same composure that had guided her through childhood's uncertainties. She emerged from the broken marriage not diminished, but sharpened, as though she had tested one script and found it wanting. There was in her no bitterness, only a quiet awareness that life must be lived beyond the expectations of others. The world of the 1920s was itself shifting. Women smoked in public, cut their hair short, danced with abandon, and claimed freedoms their mothers could not. Thelma, elegant rather than flamboyant, belonged to this new generation, not in its loudest expressions, but in its subtle assertion of choice. After the divorce, she stepped into the broader stage of society with an independence that made her all the more intriguing. She traveled, she appeared in gatherings of note, and she cultivated the aura of a woman who was both accessible and beyond capture. Divorce had not made her lesser in the eyes of those who courted glamour. It had, in some ways, made her more alluring. For in a world fascinated by women who defied old constraints, Thelma represented the paradox of freedom cloaked in refinement. She was no longer only the quiet twin, no longer only the compliant wife. She was now a figure of her own making, moving between continents with the confidence of one who knew she could survive rupture and continue with grace. And yet, as with so much of her life, there was always the undercurrent of contradiction. She sought stability, and yet she was drawn to men whose lives were marked by power and restlessness. She longed for intimacy, yet she was often caught in relationships defined by social performance. She presented serenity, yet her path was strewn with upheaval. These contradictions had their roots in childhood, in the endless shifting of homes and fortunes, and now they shaped her as a young woman navigating a world both dazzled by her and indifferent to her inner needs. The end of her first marriage was not merely an event, but a transformation. It was the threshold from girlhood into the woman who would soon step into nobility, and from there into the arms of a prince. She had learned that love within the gilded halls of society was not simple, that alliances were as fragile as the glass goblets raised in toast, that wealth could shield but not satisfy. Thelma carried these lessons quietly, storing them as she always had, as though preparing herself for a stage upon which the consequences would be far greater. And so, the clinking of champagne glasses from her wedding night fades, their sound diminishing into echoes that can no longer be distinguished from the murmurs of countless other celebrations. What remains is the quiet image of Thelma, seated by a window after her divorce, her gaze turned outward once again, the light falling across her profile, serene yet touched by an unspoken resolve. Outside, the city hums with the noises of the modern age, horns of automobiles, the distant whistle of trains, the laughter of revelers spilling from clubs into the night. She sits apart, listening, waiting, poised at the threshold of reinvention. And as the sound of those champagne glasses fades completely into silence, another sound rises, low and steady, the purr of a motorcar engine turning over in the London fog, waiting to carry her toward a future neither certain nor safe. The motorcar hums in the fog, its headlights throwing pale cones of light that vanish almost at once into the damp London air. The sound is steady, insistent, as though calling Thelma forward into a new chapter of her existence. She has stepped out from the echo of broken champagne glasses, from the ceremony and collapse of her first marriage, and now she inhales the cold night with a quiet sense of both loss and possibility. Divorce had stripped away the illusion of permanence, but it had also given her something rarer, something that was becoming precious among women of her generation, the chance to define herself outside the boundaries of a husband's shadow. London in the 1920s was a city alive with reinvention. The war had left scars, visible in the faces of soldiers and invisible in the moods of households that had lost sons. But it had also opened doors to new ways of living. Women bobbed their hair, raised their hemlines, and walked the streets with the daring suggestion that their lives belonged to them alone. Jazz clubs pulsed in basements where smoke hung thick in the air, while above ground the polished rituals of the aristocracy still played out in drawing rooms and mansions. It was a city of contrasts, and Thelma, who had always lived among contradictions, found herself strangely at home within it. She began to move through the social world with grace, her American origins adding a freshness that London society often found irresistible. There was a fascination then with American women, who seemed to embody both freedom and wealth, carrying with them the aura of a nation rising in influence. They were admired for their directness, envied for their beauty, and sometimes distrusted for their disregard of old hierarchies. Thelma, however, did not storm her way into this world. She slipped into it with quiet elegance, her demeanor poised, her voice soft yet distinct. She was noticed not because she clamored for attention, but because her presence drew it without effort. The years after her divorce were not idle. She traveled. She attended gatherings that glittered with laughter and champagne, and she cultivated friendships with artists, aristocrats, and businessmen. In this weaving of connections, she seemed always to hover between roles: the independent woman who had cast off an unsatisfying marriage, and the socialite who still moved within the expectations of her time. Perhaps she herself felt the tension between those roles. Was she seeking love, or was she seeking position? Did she long for intimacy, or for the security that society offered? Such questions, lingering quietly, would shape the choices she made and would echo most loudly when she later stood in the shadow of royalty. Her reinvention was not only social, but personal. She adopted the fashions of her age with a subtlety that amplified her natural elegance. Dresses of silk that caught the light, cloche hats worn at angles that framed her dark eyes, jewels chosen not for extravagance, but for the quiet suggestion of refinement. She was never the most flamboyant woman in the room, but she was often the most remembered. It is said that true beauty lies not in perfection, but in presence, and Thelma possessed presence in abundance. She had the ability to make a moment feel suspended, as though nothing else existed while she stood near. Men were drawn to it, women observed it with curiosity, and society began to whisper her name with increasing frequency. In those years, she also began to cultivate a sense of independence that had been impossible within her first marriage. She chose her own companions, she charted her own movements, and she carried herself with the composure of one who has faced the collapse of expectation and emerged still whole. There is a quiet strength in such composure, though it often goes unrecognized until tested again. For Thelma, this strength was a preparation, though she could not yet know for what. It was during this period of reinvention that she came into contact with the wider British aristocracy, a world both dazzling and confining. Invitations led her into homes where walls were lined with portraits centuries old, where silver gleamed upon long tables, where conversation was a dance of wit and caution. To many, such circles were intimidating, but to Thelma, who had learned to adapt since childhood, they were simply another stage upon which to move with grace. She was admired not only for her beauty, but for her restraint. For unlike some who sought to impress with exuberance, she impressed by seeming to need no effort at all. The independence of divorce carried its price. There were whispers, subtle judgments, and the occasional lifting of eyebrows. Yet in the 1920s, such whispers were already becoming less harsh, softened by the knowledge that divorce was no longer the scandal it once had been. In fact, there was a growing allure in a woman who had been married and freed, who carried with her the suggestion of experience, of choices made boldly rather than passively. Thelma embodied this allure, though she never wielded it with brazenness. Instead, she remained herself, poised, observant, quietly radiant. And yet, beneath her calm exterior, there may have been a longing she could not easily admit, a longing for a connection that was not merely social, not merely advantageous, but deeply personal. Having tasted the emptiness of a marriage without intimacy, perhaps she desired something more, something that might sustain her spirit, even as it unsettled her place in society. Such longings, unspoken, often prepare the ground for choices that change lives. As she moved through the smoky ballrooms and the hushed drawing rooms of London, Thelma was both part of the crowd and apart from it. She was present at dinners where laughter rang against crystal, and at dances where orchestras played the newest American rhythms. Yet always there was the sense that she stood at a threshold, waiting for the next step that destiny would place before her. The sound of the motor car in the fog was never far away, a reminder that movement, change, and the unexpected had always been companions in her journey. It was in these years of reinvention that she prepared herself, without knowing it, for the encounter that would alter her story forever. The man she would meet was no mere aristocrat, no mere figure of wealth or charm, but the heir to an empire, restless and searching. Their paths had not yet crossed, but the city in which they both moved was small in its highest circles, and sooner or later they were destined to meet. And so the image fades once more. Thelma stands at the edge of a ballroom, her gloved hand resting lightly on the stem of a glass, her gaze steady but distant. Around her, laughter rises, music swells, and yet her stillness makes her seem apart, as though listening for something only she can hear. Beyond the ballroom doors, the fog presses against the windows, and somewhere beyond it, a figure waits, restless, impatient, longing for a woman who might soothe his unsettled soul. The hollow echo of footsteps across marble halls begins to sound, carrying us toward the meeting that will define her destiny. The echo of footsteps across the marble hall lingers, hollow and deliberate, as though some unseen presence moves closer, carrying with it the weight of doors about to be opened. For Thelma, these footsteps belong not only to the moment, but to the very course of her life, which now led her toward another marriage, one that promised a title, a place within the British aristocracy, and a measure of permanence she had never truly known. Yet, as with so many promises, it would prove to hold within it both gilded light and hidden shadows. In 1926, Thelma Morgan, no longer the uncertain young divorcee, but a woman already practiced in the arts of society, married Marmaduke Furness, 1st Viscount Furness. He was a man of immense wealth, owner of a vast shipping empire, and a figure who moved with ease among the elite of Britain. Their union was not only a joining of two lives, but of two worlds. Her American freshness, with its sense of daring independence, and his entrenched position within the traditions of British nobility. For Thelma, this marriage was an ascent, a step into a realm where her beauty and poise could find both admiration and influence. The wedding itself was marked not by youthful excitement, but by the solemnity of position. Unlike her first marriage, which had been gilded by the brightness of youth and the novelty of society's gaze, this one carried an air of gravity. Thelma was not yet 25, yet she entered the role of Viscountess with the composure of a woman who had already learned that appearances must be kept even when hearts remain uncertain. The title Lady Furness clothed her like a garment, both heavy and resplendent, a name that would open doors but also confine her within expectations that were centuries old. Their life together was one of grandeur, homes adorned with portraits of ancestors, halls that echoed with the memories of old gatherings, dinners where silver gleamed under candlelight and guests spoke with practiced wit. Thelma moved through this world as though born to it, her presence admired for its refinement, her American background adding a spark of novelty that intrigued the British elite. To many, she seemed the very image of a successful marriage, young, beautiful, titled, and enveloped in wealth. Yet beneath the surface, as always, lay complexities that the glitter of society could not erase. Marmaduke Furness was a man of power, accustomed to command, and his interests extended beyond the private sphere. His role in industry and his responsibilities to the shipping empire demanded his time and attention, leaving Thelma to navigate the social landscape often on her own. Their marriage, though not unhappy in its early days, carried within it an imbalance. For Thelma, who longed for connection, it offered position more than intimacy, stability more than tenderness. And so, though she bore the title of Lady Furness with grace, she remained a woman who quietly yearned for something beyond the gilded cage in which she found herself. This is often the paradox of nobility. The very privileges that seem most coveted are those that weigh most heavily. The marble halls, the glittering dinners, the respect of one's name, all are splendid, yet they also bind. For Thelma, who had grown accustomed to movement and reinvention, the role of Viscountess was both triumph and imprisonment. She wore her jewels as though they were natural to her, but in their sparkle, one might also see the reflection of her solitude. And yet, it must be said that Thelma was not merely passive in this role. She embraced the opportunities it gave her, cultivating a social presence that drew admiration not only in Britain, but across the Atlantic. She hosted gatherings, attended events of political and cultural significance, and became known as a figure of charm and elegance. Her life was documented in the society pages, her face photographed, her gowns described in detail. In such moments, she became part of the spectacle of her age, admired and discussed, a name spoken in the same breath as other transatlantic socialites who bridged the old and new worlds. But again, as in her first marriage, there were fractures. Thelma and Marmaduke's union was not built upon deep intimacy, and in time those fractures widened. He was a man nearly 20 years her senior, with experiences and habits that did not easily align with her own. Though there was no great scandal between them, there was also no lasting bond. They drifted, and though their marriage formally endured for a time, it became increasingly a partnership of appearances rather than of shared life. It was within this context of grandeur and quiet dissatisfaction that Thelma's path began to shift once more. For it is often in the spaces of loneliness, within marriages that glitter but do not glow, that new encounters carry the greatest force. And in the circles where she moved, in the halls of aristocracy, and among the bright gatherings of London's elite, there was one figure who stood above all others, Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne. Restless, charming, eager for companionship, he was a man who carried both the burden of a nation's expectation and the longing for personal escape. Thelma, with her beauty, her poise, and her quiet strength, was precisely the sort of presence that could soothe him. It is tempting, from our distance, to see their meeting as inevitable, as though destiny had been drawing them together from the first. The restless prince, weary of constraint, and the poised American, restless within privilege, two souls caught between worlds, each seeking in the other a kind of refuge. Whether fate or accident, the meeting was one that would change both their lives. But before that meeting, there were still the marble halls, the echo of footsteps, the weight of the title Lady Furness. Thelma moved through them with grace, her image fixed in the minds of those who saw her, her composure admired, her beauty whispered about. And yet, in the quiet moments when the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, she was still a woman seated in a vast room, listening to the silence, wondering whether this gilded existence would ever give her the intimacy she longed for. The image we leave here is of Thelma walking slowly across one such marble hall, her footsteps echoing softly as her gown trails behind her. The house is quiet. The portraits of ancestors watch in silence, and her reflection glimmers faintly in the polished floor. She pauses, her hand resting upon the edge of a silver tea tray, its surface catching the moonlight from a high window. In that moment, poised and solitary, she stands upon the threshold of destiny. For soon, very soon, the echo of her own footsteps will be met by those of a prince whose restlessness will draw him toward her with irresistible force. The moonlight rests upon the silver tea tray, a pale glimmer caught in the stillness of a quiet hall. Thelma's hand lingers at its edge, her reflection faintly outlined upon its polished surface, as though she peers not only at her face, but at the uncertainty of her own path. It is from this moment of solitude, from this still life of silver and silence, that another presence enters the frame of her story. For in the very circles where she now moved, dinners, weekends at country houses, discreet gatherings where laughter mingled with smoke and champagne, the figure of Edward, Prince of Wales, was never far away. Restless, charming, weary of the expectations that bound him, he moved through society with the hunger of a man seeking something he could not name. It was into his orbit that Thelma Furness, Lady Furness by title, but still searching for herself, was drawn. Their first meeting was not announced by fanfare, but by the quiet inevitability of shared circles. Both belonged to that rarefied world where wealth and titles converged, where invitations crossed oceans, and where Americans, with their vigor and independence, had become increasingly present in the drawing rooms of British aristocracy. Edward was known to surround himself with companions who could offer him distraction from the relentless duties of his station, companions who carried lightness into a life that seemed otherwise weighted by ceremony. Thelma, with her serene composure and her delicate charm, was precisely the sort of figure who could catch his restless eye. Accounts differ as to the exact moment their eyes met, yet one can imagine the scene, a gathering at a country estate, the air heavy with the scent of cigars and roses, the sound of music drifting faintly from another room. Edward, dressed with the effortless elegance of a man accustomed to uniforms and tailored suits, entered with his characteristic energy, speaking in quick bursts, laughing easily yet always scanning, always searching. And there, among the guests, was Thelma. Not the loudest, not the most flamboyant, but the one whose stillness seemed to draw others toward her. Their eyes met, and in that meeting there was no spectacle, only the quiet recognition of two restless spirits who, for a time, might find solace in each other. What drew him to her? Perhaps it was her beauty, for she was indeed striking. Dark eyes, fine features, the kind of elegance that photographs captured with reverence. Yet beauty alone was never enough to hold Edward's attention. He had been surrounded by it all his life. More likely, it was her manner, the combination of American openness with European refinement, her ability to listen without intrusion, to offer companionship without demand. In her presence, he found not the weight of judgment, but the ease of intimacy. For Thelma, who had longed for connection within her gilded yet lonely marriages, Edward's attentions must have felt like the stirring of a long-awaited flame. Their acquaintance deepened swiftly, as such things often do in circles where time is marked not by hours but by the rhythm of weekends at country houses and evenings drawn late into the night. Thelma became a frequent guest at gatherings where Edward sought relief from his obligations. They rode together on horseback through the quiet stretches of Windsor, the air cool and filled with the scent of damp earth. They walked along gardens, speaking not of politics or duty, but of small things, shared observations, fragments of thought. In such simple exchanges lay the intimacy Edward craved. It was not long before the companionship grew into something more, though discreetly at first. The Prince of Wales, heir to a vast empire, could not move freely, his every gesture observed. Yet Thelma, with her calm presence, gave him a sanctuary. At Fort Belvedere, the retreat Edward cherished, she would arrive quietly, welcomed not only by him, but by the small circle of friends who formed his inner world. There, away from the scrutiny of court and press, they found space for their affection to grow. Imagine the evenings at Fort Belvedere, the fire crackling in the grate, the scent of polished wood and tobacco, the laughter of friends gathered for dinner. Edward at ease, his manner boyish, his worries softened by the presence of those he trusted, and beside him, Thelma, her voice gentle, her smile restrained yet warm, a steady counterpoint to his restless energy. To those who observed, it seemed clear that she had captured his attention in a way others had not. For a time, she was not merely another guest, not merely a companion, but the woman closest to the heir of the throne. Yet even in the quiet of such companionship, shadows lingered. Edward was known for his shifting affections, his inability to remain bound to one woman for long. Thelma, poised and intelligent, must have understood this, must have sensed the fragility of her place at his side. And yet perhaps that was part of the allure, the knowledge that what she held was precious because it could so easily slip away. She gave herself to the role not with naivety, but with the acceptance of one who had already learned the impermanence of promises. For Edward, Thelma represented a respite, a pause in the storm of his obligations. For Thelma, Edward represented intensity, a chance to live within a story larger than her own. Together they formed a pair that fascinated those who knew, though their affair remained discreet enough not to provoke scandal at first. She was introduced to his world not as a scandalous figure, but as a companion, accepted by his circle, tolerated by those who understood the peculiar needs of a prince too restless to live within the strictures of monarchy alone. In those early days of their affection, there must have been moments of quiet joy, a hand resting lightly upon another in the shadow of a carriage, the sound of shared laughter echoing across a garden path, the stillness of evenings when the duties of the day had faded and they sat together in comfortable silence. These are the moments history often forgets, yet they are the ones that matter most to those who live them. But history does not pause, and neither did Edward's restless nature. Even as he drew Thelma close, there were whispers of other women, of other distractions. Thelma, who had built her life upon composure, did not confront these whispers openly. Instead, she continued to give him the serenity he sought, perhaps hoping that her quiet strength would prove more enduring than the charms of others. For a time, it did. She was, after all, the woman he introduced to friends, the one who sat beside him at dinners, the one whose presence softened his restlessness. And so the moonlight on the silver tray becomes the moonlight on another evening, glinting now upon the bridle of a horse as Thelma and Edward ride together through the woods. The sound of hooves strikes the earth, muffled yet rhythmic, carrying them deeper into the shadows of Windsor. In the hush of the trees, away from the gaze of the world, they move side by side, two figures bound not by duty, but by desire, their breath visible in the cool air, and as the hoofbeats fade into the distance, the muffled strike of a distant church bell begins to toll, marking not only the hour but the passing of another threshold in Thelma's life. The bell tolls across the distant fields, its low vibrations rolling through the night air, mingling with the muffled rhythm of hooves striking the earth. For Thelma and Edward, riding side by side through the wooded paths of Windsor, the sound was less a summons to worship than a reminder of time itself, of the hours that slipped quietly away in their company, hidden from the eyes of the world. The secret affair that blossomed between them did not declare itself with spectacle or scandal at first. It unfolded in murmurs, in glances, in the stolen intimacies of evenings and weekends spent in retreat from the public gaze. And in those moments of concealment, a paradox emerged, for secrecy can deepen passion as much as it erodes it. Edward, restless prince, heir to an empire that stretched across continents, found in Thelma a rare serenity. Where others pressed him with demands, she offered ease. Where others dazzled with loudness, she captivated with restraint. Their companionship was a sanctuary for him, a space in which he could lay aside the weight of his role, if only for a while, and feel himself a man rather than a monarch in waiting. For Thelma, The affair was at once thrilling and precarious. She knew well that his affections shifted like the winds, and yet she also knew the power of presence, the ability to create moments so complete in themselves that questions of tomorrow seemed less urgent. Fort Belvedere became the heart of their affair. That secluded estate, nestled among Surrey's woods, was Edward's refuge, and Thelma's presence there gave it the air of a private home rather than a royal retreat. The house itself, with its gabled roofs and quiet lawns, became a stage for a kind of intimacy denied to him elsewhere. Within its rooms, warmed by fires and softened by laughter, they shared meals with a circle of friends who understood the delicate balance between companionship and discretion. The walls heard not the pomp of court, but the quiet sound of cards shuffled at tables, of gramophone records crackling with jazz, of voices softened by the hush of evening. In such settings, the line between friendship and romance blurred, and Thelma's role became both public and private. She was not announced as a consort, nor was she hidden away as a shameful secret. She was simply there, woven into the fabric of Edward's private life, her presence a constant that others came to accept without comment. Perhaps this was the greatest sign of her influence, that she did not need to demand recognition, for her calm integration into his world made recognition unnecessary. Yet secrecy was never complete. Whispers traveled through the channels of high society, murmurs passed along drawing rooms, observations noted and left deliberately unspoken. It was understood that the Prince of Wales had a favored companion, and though names were rarely published, those who moved in his circles knew them well. For Thelma, this liminal space between secrecy and acknowledgement was both intoxicating and unsettling. She held a place in his life that was real and yet not official, powerful and yet fragile. Did she wonder as the evenings wore on what future such a position could hold? Did she imagine herself, even fleetingly, as more than a companion, or did she already sense that her role was destined to be temporary? The affair itself was marked less by drama than by constancy. They rode together, walked together, laughed together. He leaned on her, trusted her, shared with her the restlessness that plagued him. She offered a steady presence, neither overwhelming him with demands nor fading into passivity. In this balance lay the strength of their connection, and yet balance is always delicate, easily tipped by the arrival of new influences or the shifting of desires. For Edward, whose heart and attentions wandered easily, Thelma's serenity may have been both her greatest gift and her greatest risk. She gave him stability, but stability can be mistaken for complacency in the eyes of one who craves novelty. Still, in those years of the late 1920s and early 1930s, she was the woman who held his affection, the one who traveled with him, who stood beside him in moments both public and private. Photographs from that era capture her elegance, her dark hair and refined features, a woman who carried herself with quiet assurance, even as she lived a life balanced precariously between acceptance and exclusion. And secrecy, while deepening their intimacy, also carried its own burdens. To love in secret is to live always in halves, half the self given freely, half concealed, half the truth spoken, half left unspoken. It creates intimacy, yes, but it also breeds doubt, the question of how much is hidden not only from the world but from each other. Thelma, who had already known the fragility of marriage, must have felt the precariousness of this love, yet she did not shrink from it. Instead, she embraced what it offered, perhaps believing that even temporary passion was worth more than empty permanence. Their moments together were marked by the small details that memory clings to long after grand gestures fade. The warmth of Edward's laughter when she teased him gently about his impatience, the way his hand lingered at her elbow as they entered a room together, the softness of evenings when the rest of the house slept, and only the ticking of a clock marked the passage of time. These were the threads of their affair, delicate, unremarkable to history, yet essential to the lives of those who lived them. And yet, history was never far away. The Prince of Wales was not a private man, however much he longed to be. His actions were watched, his choices scrutinized, his companions noted. Even if the press remained restrained by unwritten codes, those codes could be broken, and whispers could at any moment become declarations. Thelma must have known that her position was never entirely secure, that the same discretion which protected her could also erase her. For in the great narratives of monarchy, those who love princes without marrying them often become shadows, remembered only for the role they played in leading toward another. Still, for a time she was content, or at least appeared so. Their secret affair was a life within a life, a place where she could be more than a title, more than a hostess, more than the quiet twin. With Edward, she was simply Thelma, admired, desired, needed. It was a role that gave her both joy and uncertainty, a role that history would later overshadow with another name, but one that, in its moment, was real. As the church bell's final toll fades, the night grows still again. The house at Fort Belvedere stands quiet, its windows glowing faintly against the dark woods. Inside, voices fall to murmurs, the laughter of the evening drifting into silence. Thelma and Edward sit together, the fire casting flickering light across their faces. Outside, unseen, the bell's echo lingers in the air, a reminder that secrecy cannot last forever, that every hidden flame must one day face the light. The fire crackles, sparks rising into the chimney, and in the hush between words, one hears the faint shimmer of a gown disappearing behind velvet curtains. The shimmer of her gown slips behind the velvet curtain, the faint rustle of silk swallowed by the silence of the room. Yet on the other side of that curtain, the world is alive with sound and light. For Thelma's life as the prince's companion had become deeply entwined with the very fabric of high society. If their private moments at Fort Belvedere gave her intimacy and respite, it was in the salons and ballrooms of London that her presence became visible, admired, and quietly scrutinized. To be with the prince was not only to love in secret, it was also to play a role upon society's stage, a role where every gesture, every word, and every appearance was woven into the larger performance of aristocracy in the interwar years. The 1920s had taught London to live quickly, as though each night must be filled with brilliance to distract from the memory of war. By the early 1930s, this brilliance had not dimmed, but grown more complex, infused with both gaiety and an undercurrent of unease. In grand townhouses along Belgravia and Mayfair, chandeliers burned above polished floors, while orchestras played the music of both Strauss and jazz. The scent of tobacco smoke mingled with roses, and champagne flowed freely, though always with an awareness that prosperity was fragile in a world where economies were beginning to tremble. Into this glittering environment, Thelma entered, her beauty and elegance marking her as a natural fixture of its gatherings. She was often seen at the prince's side, though never in an official capacity. To most, she was Lady Furness, the American-born Viscountess, admired for her composure and envied for her closeness to the heir to the throne. Her gowns were described in society pages, her presence noted discreetly, her movements the subject of private speculation, yet she carried herself with the same serenity that had first drawn Edward to her. She did not flaunt her position, nor did she shrink from it. Instead, she moved with the confidence of one who belonged without needing to assert it. High society in that age was both dazzling and ruthless. It offered glamour, but it demanded performance. Women were admired not only for their beauty, but for their ability to host, to charm, to create atmospheres in which men of power could feel at ease. Thelma understood this instinctively. At gatherings, she did not dominate conversation, but she guided it. allowing others to feel illuminated by her presence. In this way, she became more than a figure of beauty. She became a figure of influence, the woman who could anchor the restless prince in the midst of endless distractions. Yet this world was also one of masks. Behind the laughter and music, there were calculations, rivalries, whispers exchanged in corners. Every guest carried not only a name but an agenda, and every hostess knew that her reputation could rise or fall with a single misstep. For Thelma, already marked by the ambiguous position of divorcee turned viscountess and now mistress to the prince, the balance was especially delicate. She walked through ballrooms with grace, but always aware that eyes followed her, some admiring, others waiting for the smallest hint of scandal. Perhaps she understood that she was playing a role not entirely of her own choosing. In these settings, she was both participant and spectacle, her life woven into the gossip and fascination of others. Yet within herself, she may have sought something deeper, something more lasting than the ephemeral brilliance of chandeliers and champagne. Did she wonder, as she stood beside Edward at yet another dinner, whether the admiration of a room could ever replace the intimacy of a single steady gaze? Did she feel herself drifting between the two worlds, the private sanctuary of Fort Belvedere and the glittering stage of London society, never fully at home in either? Still, it cannot be denied that she shone. Photographs from the era capture her poise, the elegance of her gowns, the way she carried herself as though aware of being seen, yet never performing for the camera. In these images, she appears timeless, her beauty untouched by the noise that surrounded her. Perhaps this was her true gift, the ability to remain serene in the midst of spectacle, to offer calm even while caught in a storm of lights and voices. Edward relied upon this quality. In gatherings where he grew restless, her presence steadied him. In moments when the weight of his role pressed heavily, she provided a quietness that reminded him of his humanity. Their bond, though not shouted to the world, was visible to those who knew how to look. She was the one to whom his gaze often turned, the one whose silence softened his energy. In a society obsessed with display, their connection thrived in subtleties. Yet high society is never static. Its glitter is both allure and danger, for it draws not only admirers, but rivals. Thelma, though secure for a time in Edward's affection, must have felt the unease of competition, the knowledge that in such circles no position is unassailable. Beauty draws beauty, charm invites charm, and the restless heart of a prince is not easily bound. This awareness, quiet yet persistent, may have lingered at the edges of her mind as she moved through crowded rooms, smiling, listening, watching. In those years, however, she remained his favored companion. She was seen with him at races, at dinners, at gatherings, both public and private. Their affair was an open secret, tolerated if not acknowledged, woven into the rhythm of society life. And in this acceptance lay both security and fragility. For so long as whispers remained whispers, she could continue in her role. But should the balance shift, should attention grow too sharp, everything could be undone. The nights in London ballrooms were filled with brilliance, but they always ended in silence. After the music faded and the guests departed, after the lights dimmed and the streets grew still, Thelma would return to the solitude that fame cannot banish. Perhaps she would sit before her mirror, removing her jewels one by one, each clasp undone with care, until only her own reflection remained, stripped of ornament, waiting in the quiet. Outside, carriages and automobiles rattled away into the distance, their sounds fading into nothing. And within that fading, one might imagine her asking herself what all the glitter truly meant, and how long it might last. The shimmer of her gown, the music of the evening, the fragrance of roses crushed beneath the heat of crowded rooms, all dissolve as the night deepens. What remains is the soft sound of leather, of a glove being drawn tight around a wrist, its string left unfastened, hanging loose. It sways slightly with each movement of her hand, a detail unnoticed by others, yet full of meaning for us who look back. For in that unfinished gesture lies the suggestion of something unresolved, something precarious, as though fate itself had paused mid-motion, waiting to be drawn taut. The glove string hangs loose, swaying with the faintest movement of her wrist, as though suspended between fastening and release. It is a small thing, overlooked in the brilliance of a ballroom, yet for Thelma it mirrored the deeper truths of her life with Edward. An intimacy present yet unbound, secure only so long as circumstance did not pull it away. Beneath the velvet curtains, the chandeliers, and the murmured compliments of London's gatherings, she was beginning to sense the shifting currents of rivalry that moved quietly beneath the polished surface of high society. For though she was, for a time, the favored companion of the prince, others lingered at the edges of his gaze, waiting for their moment to step forward. Edward had never been a man of constancy in affection. From his youth, he had surrounded himself with women who offered him escape from the suffocating discipline of his royal role. Married women, foreign women, women of spirit and independence. These were the figures who drew him, for they asked of him not duty, but presence, not monarchy, but humanity. Thelma, with her calm serenity, had given him a sanctuary, a place where his restless energy could find balance. Yet the very restlessness that had first drawn him to her was also what made her place precarious. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that affection in Edward's world was like the wind. It shifted direction without warning, carrying with it the warmth of new attentions while leaving others to fade quietly into memory. Still, Thelma did not confront these shifting winds with open protest. Her strength lay in her composure, in the ability to offer steadiness where others brought drama. She was not the woman who demanded declarations, nor the one who clung with desperate pleas. Instead, she remained poised, believing, or perhaps hoping, that the constancy of her presence would prove more enduring than the excitement of novelty. It was a dignified response, yet also a vulnerable one. For in a world where novelty often triumphed, dignity could be easily overlooked. There were other women, even before Wallis Simpson, who attracted Edward's attention. Names floated quietly in conversation. Figures appeared at gatherings with smiles that lingered a moment too long, laughter that drew his eye across a crowded room. Thelma, standing near him, would have seen these glances, heard the subtle notes in his voice. Did she feel a pang of fear, or had she already accepted that rivalry was woven into the fabric of her position? Perhaps it was both, a quiet ache balanced by the knowledge that love, in Edward's world, was never a possession but a passing flame. High society itself was fertile ground for rivalry. Women moved through it with gowns that shimmered like weapons, with perfumes that lingered like claims upon the air. Each sought not only admiration but influence, for to be close to the Prince of Wales was to be near the heart of power, even if only in whispers and evenings. Thelma, though she did not seek power openly, could not escape the fact that her place was envied. And envy, in such circles, often took the form of competition, veiled as charm. A smile that seemed friendly, a compliment that masked calculation, a hand that lingered in greeting. All these were the gestures of rivalry that surrounded her. But rivalry is not always external. Within Edward himself lay the greatest uncertainty. He longed for intimacy, yet he also feared confinement. He sought constancy, yet he was captivated by change. Thelma, serene and enduring, may have satisfied one part of him while leaving another restless. She must have sensed this, must have known that her greatest rival was not any particular woman, but the prince's own inability to remain content with what he had. It is a cruel fate to love a man whose heart is as mercurial as the winds across the sea, and yet Thelma accepted it with the same grace that had carried her through every turn of her life. In those years, her composure became her armor. At gatherings when Edward's attention wavered or strayed, she did not protest. She smiled, she listened, she held her place with quiet dignity. Others may have mistaken this for indifference, but in truth it was resilience, the knowledge that to confront too openly was to risk losing entirely. Perhaps she believed that her steadiness would, in the end, outlast the distractions. Or perhaps she simply understood that in a world of rivalries, silence was sometimes the only strength left to wield. And yet, silence carries its own questions. Did she, in the privacy of her rooms, ever ask herself whether serenity was enough? Whether dignity alone could sustain a love so fragile? Did she wonder if her refusal to fight openly for him was wisdom, or if it was surrender disguised as composure? History cannot answer, for Thelma herself left little record of such thoughts. But we, looking back, may sense the unfastened glove string still swaying, unresolved, as though even she herself had not decided. For a time, however, she remained at his side. The whispers of rivalry did not displace her. The glances of others did not erase her presence. She continued to share in his private world, to sit beside him at Fort Belvedere, to walk with him in gardens where the scent of damp earth mingled with the perfume of roses. She was still the woman he turned to, still the one who steadied him when his restlessness grew too sharp. And so her place endured, even as she sensed its fragility. But the unfastened glove string cannot remain loose forever. Sooner or later it must either be tied securely or slip away altogether. Thelma may not have known it then, but the rival, who would finally shift the balance, was already moving quietly into their circle. Wallis Simpson, sharp, ambitious, and relentless, had begun to appear at the same gatherings, her presence at first incidental, her laughter at first only one among many. Yet within that laughter lay a determination that would alter not only Thelma's life, but the course of British history. For now, though, we leave Thelma still in her place, the serene presence at Edward's side, her beauty admired, her composure envied, her role intact. The rivalries beneath the surface remain whispers, unresolved, their consequences not yet revealed. The music of the evening fades once more, the last notes lingering in the air like perfume, and in the hush that follows, there is only the faint scent of perfume itself, a trace left behind by a visitor who has just departed, a scent that lingers even when the figure is gone, promising both allure and threat. The faint perfume lingers in the air long after its wearer has departed, subtle and insistent, as though the very walls of the room hold fast to the memory of her presence. For Thelma, that scent may have been little more than a curiosity at first, an afterthought following an evening of conversation and laughter. Yet perfumes, like people, can leave their mark in ways not immediately recognized, their essence clinging long after the form has vanished. So it was with Wallis Simpson, whose arrival in Edward's circle seemed at first unremarkable, yet whose presence would alter the course of Thelma's life and of history itself. Wallace Warfield Simpson was an American, like Thelma, though of a very different disposition. Where Thelma moved with serenity and restraint, Wallace carried with her a sharper edge, a wit that cut cleanly, a determination that cloaked itself in charm. Married already, and not for the first time, she was no stranger to the precarious balance between respectability and scandal. Her manner was not the soft composure of Thelma, but something more deliberate, even theatrical. She drew attention not by stillness, but by insistence, by the force of her personality and the precision of her social maneuvering. To Edward, ever restless, this sharpness was as compelling as Thelma's serenity had once been soothing. Thelma and Wallace moved in the same circles, attended the same dinners, crossed paths at the same gatherings where laughter masked calculation. At first, Thelma welcomed her, for she was accustomed to sharing the stage of society with other women. It was not unusual for Edward to surround himself with companions, and Thelma, with her characteristic composure, did not see in Wallace an immediate threat. She may even have regarded her as an ally of sorts, another American navigating the intricacies of British society, another figure caught between admiration and suspicion. There is a certain bond that arises between outsiders who find themselves in foreign courts, a recognition of shared strangeness. But beneath the polite exchanges, the compliments traded across tables, there grew a subtle unease. Wallace was not content merely to be present. She sought to occupy, to assert, to dominate the space around her. Edward, drawn to novelty, began to notice her more often, to laugh more freely at her remarks, to lean closer when she spoke. Thelma, watching with her quiet eyes, must have seen these shifts. They were small at first, barely perceptible, the kind of details only someone deeply attuned to a man's moods would observe. Yet they carried the unmistakable mark of change. How does one measure the beginning of displacement? Is it in the moment when laughter rings too loudly, or when a glance lingers a second too long? Is it in the scent of perfume left behind, refusing to fade, even when the figure herself has gone? For Thelma, the awareness must have come gradually, a creeping sense that her place beside Edward was no longer as secure as it had been. Still, she did not confront it directly. Her composure, her refusal to show jealousy or desperation, remained her shield. Perhaps she believed that serenity would prevail, that Edward would recognize the steadiness of what they shared and resist the lure of something sharper. But Edward was not a man of steadiness. His very nature leaned toward restlessness, toward change, toward the intoxication of new companionship. Wallace, with her sharp wit and unyielding determination, offered him something Thelma could not: a challenge, a resistance that both frustrated and enthralled him. Where Thelma soothed, Wallace provoked. Where Thelma listened, Wallace commanded. For a man who had grown weary of being surrounded by deference, this defiance was intoxicating. And so, the balance began to shift. The gatherings where Thelma had once been his constant companion now included Wallace more frequently. Their conversations, once flowing between Thelma and Edward with quiet ease, now found themselves interrupted, redirected, claimed by another voice. Thelma, ever graceful, did not protest. She remained present, her poise unbroken, her beauty unchanged. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the shadow of rivalry lengthened, and with it, the foreboding sense of loss. What must it have been like for her to watch the slow erosion of her place, to feel herself displaced not by scandal or rupture, but by the quiet persistence of another's presence? Did she wonder whether her serenity had become too still, too passive, leaving space for a rival's sharper force? Or did she accept, with the quiet sorrow of experience, that love in Edward's world was never meant to endure, that all companionship was temporary, destined to be replaced when the winds shifted? Even as Wallace drew closer, Thelma continued to occupy her role with dignity. She did not retreat into bitterness, nor did she attempt to wage open war for his affection. Instead, she carried on as she always had, with grace and composure, perhaps believing that her very refusal to fight might preserve what was slipping away. Yet history reminds us that serenity is not always enough against ambition, and that quietness can be drowned by the persistence of louder voices. Still, in those early days, nothing was yet certain. Edward had not abandoned Thelma. She remained close to him, still visited Fort Belvedere, still rode by his side, still shared in his private moments. The affair continued, though now shadowed by the presence of another. It was as though she stood in a room where the light still shone upon her, yet at the edges, Another figure waited, casting a faint shadow that grew longer with each passing day. The image we carry forward is of Thelma standing near the doorway of a drawing room after an evening's gathering. Around her, the voices of guests fade as they depart, their laughter trailing into the night. The scent of perfume lingers still, sharper now, more insistent, clinging to the air as though refusing to yield. Thelma stands in silence, her gloved hand resting against the polished wood of the doorframe, her gaze calm but distant. Outside, in the darkness, gulls cry faintly over the river, their calls carrying across the water like questions unanswered. It is the sound of departure, of distance, of something slipping slowly away. The cry of the gulls drifts across the water, their wings rising and falling against the gray sky, as though they circle not only the river's edge, but the very threshold of change. For Thelma, those cries became the soundtrack to another departure, another Atlantic crossing. She'd grown accustomed since childhood to the rhythm of ships, to trunks packed and unpacked, to goodbyes spoken lightly though they carried the weight of uncertainty. And now, with Wallace's perfume still lingering in the rooms she had left behind, she boarded once more a vessel bound for America, leaving Edward in London, restless and susceptible to the company of others. The great liners of the early 1930s were floating palaces, their decks wide enough to hold promenades, their dining rooms lit by chandeliers that swayed gently with the movement of the sea. Thelma, dressed in traveling attire, her dark eyes shaded beneath a cloche hat, would have walked those decks with her customary composure, her figure noted by fellow passengers, her presence admired but never intrusively approached, for she belonged to that class of traveler who seemed already set apart, not by arrogance, but by the air of someone whose destination was larger than the journey itself. As the ship pulled away from Southampton, the gulls followed for a time, circling and crying, before vanishing into the distance. Thelma leaned upon the railing, the salt air damp upon her face, watching the horizon as the shore receded. Behind her lay London, Fort Belvedere, Edward's laughter, and the uncertain shadow of Wallace. Ahead lay New York with its towers piercing the sky, its restless energy, its promise of both freedom and distraction. In between stretched the ocean, vast and indifferent, its endless gray waves reflecting the ambiguity of her own heart. There is a particular melancholy in ocean crossings, for the sea itself seems to erase certainty. Each wave folds into the next, each day passes without fixed landmarks, and one is left adrift in thought as much as in travel. Thelma must have reflected upon her position, upon the fragility of her place in Edward's life, upon the rivalries that whispered at its edges. Did she trust that his affection would endure her absence, that her calm constancy would outlast the sharper charms of others? Or did she sense, as the ship's engines rumbled deep below, that distance is the most dangerous rival of all, for it creates the very spaces into which others may step? The passengers aboard such liners formed a world of their own, a society adrift. There were businessmen bound for conferences, families seeking reunion, tourists drawn to Europe's allure, and socialites like Thelma, moving between continents as though they were rooms in a single house. Dinner at sea was an event in itself, tables laid with fine silver, the low hum of conversation mingling with the vibration of engines, the occasional laughter of those eager to forget the uncertainty of the wider world. Thelma, seated among them, would have spoken politely, smiled gently, and listened with the same attentive poise that had once captivated a prince. Yet within her, thoughts may have drifted elsewhere, across the waters she had left behind, to a man whose restlessness did not know how to wait. For Edward, Thelma's departures were both tolerated and resented. He had grown used to her presence, to her steadying influence, and when she left, he was left exposed to the loneliness he feared most. It was during one such absence, history tells us, that Wallis Simpson, already a frequent guest in his circle, began to draw closer. What began as companionship deepened, and in the silence left by Thelma's journey, Wallace's voice grew louder. Absence, more than jealousy or rivalry, was the opening through which the balance began to tip. The sea, indifferent and endless, carried Thelma forward, unaware of what it left behind. Each morning she rose to walk the deck, the horizon unbroken, the air cold and sharp. She read, she wrote letters, she spoke with fellow travelers, yet always there was the quiet knowledge that she was moving not only across an ocean, but across a turning point in her life. For in the spaces of departure and return, fates are often decided, though the traveler cannot yet see it. As the days at sea passed, the evenings grew quieter. The orchestra played in the dining salon, the sound muffled by the steady roll of waves. Outside, the deck lay empty under stars obscured by clouds, the ship moving forward with the inevitability of destiny. Thelma may have stood there alone, the wind tugging at her coat, the dark ocean stretching into invisibility, and wondered whether Edward thought of her at that same hour, or whether his restless gaze had already turned elsewhere. When at last the skyline of New York appeared, rising like a promise from the mist, the passengers crowded the decks to glimpse its towers. The Statue of Liberty stood with its torch lifted high, the harbor filled with the sound of tugboats and gulls, the smell of industry and salt mingling in the air. For Thelma, it was a return not to home exactly, for her life was now scattered across continents, but to familiarity. Here she had family, friends, a society that knew her as one of its own. Yet even in the embrace of that familiarity, there lingered the awareness of what she had left in England, and of the shadows that might have lengthened in her absence. In New York, she attended gatherings, visited family, and walked streets alive with the hum of modernity. The jazz age was not yet gone, though its brightness had dimmed with the weight of the Depression. Thelma, with her elegance, was welcomed into salons and drawing rooms, her presence noted, her beauty admired, yet she moved through them as though part of her remained elsewhere, across the sea, in a house of gables and woods where another woman's laughter was beginning to echo in her place. The rivalry with Wallace was not yet open, not yet declared, but it was already present, woven into the fabric of absence. For absence itself is a silent rival, and distance a dangerous companion. Thelma, perhaps sensing this, may have hurried her stay, may have felt the urgency of return. But time, once lost, is rarely regained, and even the swiftest ship could not undo what had already begun. The gulls cry again as another ship departs, their wings restless against the sky, their voices carrying across the harbor like warnings. Thelma stands once more at the railing, preparing for her return voyage to England. The salt wind stings her face, the waves churn against the hull, and the ocean stretches out before her, vast and indifferent. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Edward waits, but no longer alone. In the space she left behind, another presence has taken root, a presence whose perfume lingers still, sharper, more insistent, refusing to fade. And as the ship moves forward into the gray expanse, the sound of gulls fades, leaving only the low, steady groan of the door closing behind her as she steps back into a world forever altered. The door closes with a slow, resonant groan, its weight sealing the space behind her, the echo lingering as though it carried with it the last remnants of what she had left untouched. When Thelma returned to England, stepping once more onto familiar shores, she did not at first perceive the change. The streets of London still hummed with their restless rhythm. The same fog curled against the windows of Mayfair houses. The same laughter drifted from the same supper clubs. Yet behind the polished facades, in the quiet spaces where truth is often hidden, something had shifted. In her absence, the delicate balance of affection had tipped, and another voice had moved closer to Edward's heart. Wallis Simpson was no longer a visitor who lingered at the edges. She was now firmly within Edward's circle, her presence no longer incidental but expected. She was there at dinners, her sharp wit filling the silences, her laughter ringing more clearly, her gestures more assured. To those who observed, the change seemed almost natural, as though she had simply claimed a place that had been waiting for her. But for Thelma, the change was a wound, subtle yet deep, for it revealed what absence can do. It allows another to occupy the very spaces one has vacated, to leave behind a mark that cannot easily be erased. When she first saw them together, the realization must have arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, spreading chill. Edward, ever restless, leaned toward Wallace with an eagerness Thelma recognized. She knew his moods, his tones, the way his eyes softened when captivated. She had seen it before, felt it herself, and now she saw it turned elsewhere. Did she feel betrayed, or did she simply acknowledge the inevitability of what she had always known, that her place was never fixed, that love with such a man was always borrowed time? Perhaps it was both. Sorrow at the betrayal and sorrow at having believed, even briefly, that it might be otherwise. Yet Thelma did not create scenes. She did not demand explanations or make dramatic appeals. Her strength had always been composure, and she continued to wear it like armor. To those who watched, she remained poised, elegant, smiling, even as the shadow grew longer beside her. She hosted, she attended, she played her role with dignity. But within, the silence of her heart deepened. Betrayal often shouts for those who fight against it, but for those who endure quietly, it whispers, repeating itself endlessly in the mind until it becomes a steady, inescapable echo. Edward, for his part, may not have intended cruelty. He was a man who sought to fill the emptiness within him with companionship, always seeking novelty, always hungry for attention that felt genuine. He may have told himself that he still cared for Thelma, that her presence was still valued, even as he turned increasingly toward Wallace. But intentions matter little when affections shift. What Thelma had once held alone was now shared, and in matters of the heart, sharing often feels indistinguishable from loss. The irony of betrayal in such circles is that it is rarely hidden. Everyone knew, or at least suspected, what was unfolding. Friends whispered, society speculated, and yet the very structure of aristocratic life required that appearances be maintained. So Thelma continued to walk beside Edward at times, continued to be seen in his company, even as Wallace's presence grew undeniable. There is a cruelty in such duplicity, for it forces the one displaced to play along, to pretend ignorance of what is plain, to smile while watching the slow unraveling of one's place. But perhaps Thelma's silence was not only resignation. Perhaps it was also her way of retaining dignity in a world that valued spectacle over truth. By refusing to descend into scenes or scandals, she preserved something of herself that could not be taken, even as she lost him. In this, she showed a strength often overlooked, the strength not to fight battles that cannot be won, the strength to accept loss with grace. It is a quiet strength, rarely praised, but it is one that allows a soul to endure. Still, the pain must have been sharp. To love someone who no longer loves with the same intensity is to stand in a room where the warmth has gone, to sit at a table where laughter rings hollow, to walk beside a figure who is already leaning toward another. Thelma had known disappointment in her first marriage, but this was different. This was not the collapse of an arrangement, it was the loss of passion itself, the displacement of intimacy she had once believed unique. To be betrayed in absence is to return home to find not emptiness, but replacement. It is, in many ways, the cruelest form of loss. The world around them carried on as though nothing had changed. Balls continued. Newspapers printed their discreet accounts of royal engagements. The empire moved forward beneath the weight of its obligations. Yet within this continuity, Thelma's story was shifting toward its twilight. She was still admired, still beautiful, still present in the circles of high society. But her role beside Edward was waning, and though she bore it with her characteristic composure, she must have known that the tide, once turned, would not return. There is a question here, lingering like the perfume that first marked Wallace's presence. Could Thelma have done anything to prevent it? Could she have held him more tightly, fought more fiercely, resisted with sharper edges of her own? Or was the outcome inevitable, written not by her choices but by Edward's restless nature, by Wallace's determination, by the inexorable pull of history itself? We cannot know. Perhaps even Thelma herself did not know. Perhaps, as she moved through her days with calm grace, she asked herself the same questions, only to find no answers in the silence. The image that remains is one of quiet resignation. Thelma stands once more in a room of polished wood and candlelight, the voices of guests murmuring behind her, Edward's laughter mingling with Wallace's sharper tones. She does not intrude, does not demand, does not falter. Instead, she turns slightly away, her face serene, her figure outlined against the heavy doorframe. And as she steps forward, the door closes slowly behind her, its sound heavy and final, sealing her absence from the intimacy that was once hers. The house falls silent after its echo, leaving only the soft creak of its hinges fading into nothing. The door's hinges creak softly, their final note stretching thin before it dissolves into silence. Silence, that ancient companion, is rarely empty. It is filled with the echoes of what was once present and the foreboding of what will not return. For Thelma, that sound was the quiet measure of a change already complete. Her place, once secure in the orbit of the Prince of Wales, was loosening, slipping further from the center, fading like a candle left untended until its wick bends into shadow. Edward's attentions had turned elsewhere, toward the sharp laughter and relentless presence of Wallis Simpson. What began as companionship had grown into obsession, a devotion that consumed his hours and altered his very sense of self. Where Thelma had once steadied him with calm serenity, Wallace enthralled him with force and fire. It was not that Thelma had lost her beauty. Indeed, she remained striking, her poise undiminished, her presence admired. But beauty alone was not enough against the tide of Edward's restlessness, nor against the determination of a woman who demanded not just attention, but absolute possession. For Thelma, the waning of affection was not sudden. It did not break like glass, shattering all at once. It receded like the tide, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, until the shoreline stood bare, leaving her to gaze upon the emptiness where once there had been fullness. She still saw Edward, still accompanied him at times, still moved within the familiar circles of society. Yet the intimacy between them had changed. The glances that once lingered grew fleeting, the conversations that once carried depth became perfunctory. And always, at the edges, there was Wallace, sharp, insistent, claiming more space with each passing day. Society, ever attuned to shifts of power and affection, began to notice. Whispers grew louder, though still clothed in discretion. Thelma, once described as Edward's close companion, was now mentioned less frequently, her presence overshadowed by the figure who seemed destined to eclipse her. In drawing rooms, people exchanged glances, speculating on the future, while in the columns of newspapers, hints began to surface, though always veiled, for the press had not yet broken the code of silence surrounding the private affairs of royalty. Yet silence cannot conceal what everyone already sees. Thelma's star, once bright in that constellation, was dimming, while another's rose with ruthless clarity. How does one endure such a fading? to be replaced not because of failure, but because of the fickleness of desire, the shifting winds of another's heart. Thelma bore it as she bore all things, with composure. She did not erupt, did not fight openly, did not claw at what was slipping away. Instead, she accepted her diminishing place with quiet dignity, even as it must have wounded her deeply. To love and lose is a sorrow. To love and remain present while being displaced is a torment few can bear. Yet Thelma endured it, perhaps because she had always known that her role in Edward's life was fragile, destined to be temporary, however bright its flame had once burned. Her life in society continued, though now she appeared less often at Edward's side and more often among friends who offered sympathy without questions. She traveled, she attended gatherings, she hosted when she could. But the glow that had surrounded her, the allure of being the favored companion of the prince, had waned. For society admires not only beauty and elegance, but proximity to power. And when that proximity diminishes, admiration often follows suit. Thelma became less a figure of fascination and more a figure of memory, her name spoken with a kind of wistful acknowledgement. She was once his beloved, she was once the one who steadied him. And yet, within this waning, there was also a strange freedom. No longer bound by the constant demands of being Edward's solace, Thelma found herself able to move differently, to live with fewer constraints. Perhaps she even felt a measure of relief, though it came at the cost of sorrow. To be freed from a man so restless, so consuming in his needs, was to regain a measure of self. But to lose the intimacy she had cherished was to live with a hollow echo, a reminder that love, once given, rarely leaves without a trace of pain. Her later reflections suggest she did not view this time with bitterness. She accepted that her role had been real, even if temporary, and that she had played her part in a story larger than herself. She did not attempt to erase it, nor did she cling to it with regret. Instead, she seemed to understand that life, like society, moves in cycles, that one moment we are central, and the next we are peripheral, and that both positions carry their own lessons. Still, the sorrow of being supplanted cannot be denied. In quiet moments when the music of parties had faded and the rooms of her home stood silent, Thelma must have felt the weight of absence. The gramophone, perhaps left playing too long, would spin into static as the needle reached the end of its record, the music crackling and fading into nothingness. That sound, the fading crackle of a gramophone, was the sound of her place in Edward's life, once vibrant, now diminished, leaving behind only the faint hiss of memory. It is in this sound that we leave her now, seated in her drawing room, a glass of wine half finished upon the table, the gramophone spinning in the corner, its music exhausted, its crackle steady. The fire in the hearth has burned low, casting shadows across the walls. Outside, the streets of London are hushed, the fog pressing against the windows like a curtain drawn by unseen hands. She listens to the faint crackle, not moving to lift the needle, allowing it to play on, as though the sound itself held the memory of what she had lost. And in that patient listening, there is both sorrow and strength, a quiet endurance that defines her even as her star begins to fade. The gramophone crackles faintly in the quiet room, its needle still circling, tracing grooves that no longer carry melody. The sound is thin, almost ghostly, like the memory of a song that cannot be recalled in full. For Thelma, that fading music mirrored her own position, once vibrant, once central, now reduced to echoes. Yet even as the last notes dissolved into silence, life did not end. It merely shifted as it always had for her, carrying her onward into new circles, new companions, and new attempts to weave meaning out of change. Life after Edward was not a collapse, but a continuation. Thelma did not retreat from society, nor did she allow herself to become a recluse defined by what she had lost. She remained, as ever, a figure of elegance in the salons and drawing rooms of New York and London. Friends still welcomed her. Admirers still lingered. She was too beautiful, too poised, too naturally compelling to be forgotten. Yet, the glow of royal association, that light which had once set her apart, had dimmed. She was no longer spoken of as the prince's favored companion, but as the woman who had once held his heart before another claimed it. Such is the cruelty of history. It reduces whole lives into footnotes, framing people not by who they were, but by who they preceded. Still, Thelma found ways to live richly, though perhaps more quietly. She traveled often, as she always had, her life continuing to stretch across the Atlantic, that restless ribbon of water that had marked every chapter of her story. In America, she was received as a figure of fascination, her name evoking whispers of her time with Edward. In England, she retained the friendships she had cultivated, though her place in royal circles was now peripheral rather than central. In both worlds, she moved with the same serenity that had always defined her, adapting without bitterness to her altered role. There were other men, of course, suitors who admired her beauty, companions who sought her presence, figures who drifted in and out of her life. Some were fleeting, others more lasting, yet none seemed to anchor her fully. Perhaps this was by choice. Perhaps, after Edward, she knew that no affection could quite match the intensity of what she had lost. Or perhaps she had grown cautious, unwilling to bind herself again too tightly, aware of how fragile such bonds could be. Whatever the reason, her later romances were quieter, less consuming, more like companions upon the road than destinations in themselves. Society still admired her, though now it admired her as part of a larger story, rather than as a figure in her own right. She was photographed, described, invited, remembered. Yet beneath these appearances lay a subtle solitude, a sense that she was always slightly apart, always carrying within her the memory of a role that could not be reclaimed. To live as the woman before another is to carry a kind of invisibility, for one is remembered not for oneself, but for the shadow cast upon one story by another's rise. Thelma bore this with her characteristic dignity, neither seeking to erase the past nor to exploit it. She accepted it as part of her life, as she had accepted all the contradictions and upheavals that had shaped her. But even as she continued, the question must have lingered. What does one do after being loved by a man who gave up everything for another? What role remains when one has stood so close to history yet been pushed aside by it? Thelma answered not with words, but with the quiet persistence of living. She continued to appear, to travel, to be present, to exist with grace even when the world's gaze had turned elsewhere. There is a kind of strength in that, a refusal to vanish even when no longer central. Her friendships deepened in these years, particularly with those who understood the complexities of her position. She became, in many ways, more companion than lover, more confidant than mistress. She listened, as she had always listened, offering her calm presence to those who sought it. For even when her own heart was shadowed, she remained a woman whose stillness comforted others. It is perhaps the paradox of her life that the very quality which made her irreplaceable to some was the quality that made her replaceable to Edward. Serenity soothes, but it does not always bind. In her later reflections, she did not speak harshly of Edward. She remembered him with warmth, even fondness, acknowledging that their time together had been real, even if impermanent. There is something rare in such acceptance, in refusing to let bitterness poison memory. She seemed to understand that love, even when lost, remains part of one's being, shaping the soul in ways that cannot be undone. To regret it entirely would be to regret herself, and that she did not do. Life after Edward was thus a mixture of presence and absence, of appearances and silences. She remained admired, yet she was also overshadowed. She continued to live, yet she carried with her the memory of what had been lost. It was not a life of tragedy in the outward sense. She did not collapse into ruin or scandal, but it was a life tinged always by the shadow of what might have been. The image we hold is of Thelma in the garden of her home, years after Edward's affections had shifted. The leaves rustle in the breeze, their sound like the whispers of a world that has moved on. She sits upon a bench, her hands folded lightly in her lap, her gaze distant but serene. The garden is empty around her, the paths quiet, the air heavy with the scent of roses that bloom even when no one tends them. In her stillness there is both peace and solitude, both endurance and a quiet sorrow. The leaves continue to stir, their rustling carrying into the distance, as though the garden itself remembers, even when the world has forgotten. The leaves rustle faintly in the garden, their dry whispers carrying across the stillness of the empty path. It is a gentle sound, yet beneath it lies the echo of louder voices. Voices from courtrooms and newspapers, voices that would not let the Morgan family rest quietly. For even as Thelma sought composure in her own life, her twin sister Gloria was being drawn into one of the most sensational scandals of their time, the Vanderbilt custody trial, a spectacle that dragged private sorrow into public glare. And because they were twins, bound by blood and by the curiosity of others, Thelma too was pulled into its orbit, her name linked to the drama whether she willed it or not. Gloria Morgan, always the more impulsive, had married into the great Vanderbilt family, one of the wealthiest dynasties in America, and bore a daughter, also named Gloria. But when her marriage ended in tragedy with the death of her husband, she was left vulnerable, her position precarious. By the mid-1930s, a fierce battle erupted over custody of her young daughter, with the child's paternal aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, challenging Gloria's fitness as a mother. The trial, held in New York, became a sensation, filling newspapers with lurid headlines and drawing spectators eager to glimpse the dissection of one of America's most prominent families. For Thelma, the trial was not her own, yet it touched her deeply. Reporters, fascinated by the idea of twins, wove her name into their accounts, noting her past, her marriages, her role as a companion to Edward. They painted her less as an individual and more as part of a twin narrative, as though what befell one sister inevitably implicated the other. She was not on trial, yet she could not escape the shadow of it. In parlors and cafes, her name was spoken in the same breath as Gloria's, their lives entwined in the public imagination, even when their paths had diverged. The courtroom itself was a theater of humiliation. Lawyers questioned Gloria's morality, her associations, her habits, her fitness to raise her child. Witnesses testified, gossip was presented as evidence, and the press devoured every detail, printing them in bold headlines that traveled across the nation. The image of the Vanderbilt heiress, torn between family factions, became a symbol of decadence and decline in an age already troubled by economic despair. And within this spectacle, Thelma's presence lingered, even if only in the margins, her name occasionally invoked as part of the Morgan twins' story of beauty, scandal, and intrigue. What must it have felt like for Thelma to watch her sister's life dissected in such a way? Did she feel sorrow at Gloria's suffering, anger at the cruelty of the trial, or resignation at the inevitability of scandal in a family such as theirs? Perhaps she felt all of these, layered one upon the other. She knew well how society could exalt and discard, how whispers could become weapons, how reputation could be undone by forces beyond one's control. She had lived it in her own way, though never so publicly as Gloria. To see her sister exposed so ruthlessly must have stirred in her a quiet dread, for even when the scandal was not her own, it clung to her by association. The press relished the contrast between the sisters. Thelma, serene, poised, linked to royalty. Gloria, impulsive, embroiled in custody battles, accused of frivolity and neglect. Yet beneath this contrast lay a deeper truth. Both had been caught by forces larger than themselves, forces of wealth, expectation, and the unrelenting gaze of society. One was displaced by love, the other by scandal. Both were reduced by the public to symbols rather than individuals, their complexities erased by the simplicity of headlines. The custody trial ended with Gloria losing guardianship of her daughter, a judgment that left scars not only upon her, but upon the family as a whole. The child, little Gloria, would grow up under the care of others, her future shaped by the spectacle that had defined her childhood. For Thelma, the trial left a different scar, a reminder that no matter how composed one may be, no matter how carefully one walks through the halls of society, scandal can arrive unbidden, carried not only by one's own choices but by those of family, by the accidents of fate. In later years, the Vanderbilt custody trial would be remembered as one of the defining scandals of the age, a spectacle of wealth and sorrow that fascinated the public even as it destroyed private lives. For Thelma, it was a chapter not of her making, yet one she could not escape. It reinforced the sense that her life, like her sister's, was never entirely her own, but always subject to the gaze and judgment of others. And yet, she endured. She did not collapse under the weight of association, nor did she distance herself cruelly from her sister. She remained, as ever, composed, accepting that scandal, like betrayal, was another current in the restless tide of her life. She had learned long ago that one cannot control the stories others tell. One can only decide how to carry oneself within them. And so she carried herself with dignity, her name spoken in whispers not entirely her own, her image still that of a woman poised even amid the storms of others. The image we leave here is not of the courtroom, with its gavel strikes and shouting voices, but of Thelma standing in her own parlor, the newspapers spread upon the table before her. The ink still smells sharp, the pages filled with her sister's name, her own mentioned in passing. She reads quietly, her face serene, her eyes steady. Outside, the city moves with its usual rhythm, carriages rattling, footsteps echoing, voices calling. But within the room there is only the sound of a single gavel strike echoing in memory, its force reverberating through walls it was never meant to reach. The gavel strike echoes, firm and unyielding, reverberating across a courtroom far from Thelma's own rooms. Yet its sound seems to linger in her memory, as if carried through unseen corridors. Long after the trial was concluded, long after her sister's tears had dried and the newspapers had turned to other stories, that echo remained, a symbol of how lives can be judged by voices not their own. And as the years passed, as the brilliance of the 1920s and 30s gave way to the shadows of war and the inevitable fading of youth, Thelma found herself retreating not into obscurity, but into reflection. It was not the noisy withdrawal of scandal, nor the spectacle of collapse, but a quieter kind of life, one marked by remembrance, by moments of solitude, by the attempt to make sense of what had been lived and lost. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, the world had changed around her. The gaiety of London ballrooms was replaced by blackout curtains and the wail of sirens. The fortunes of great families were consumed by taxes, by war efforts, by the collapse of old empires. The monarchy itself was transformed, for Edward had renounced the throne to marry Wallace, a decision that shook the foundations of Britain and confirmed what Thelma had already known, that her place in his life had been not only temporary, but overshadowed by a passion so consuming that it altered history. To see the man she had once loved cast aside the crown of an empire for another woman must have stirred in her a complex mixture of emotions, sorrow, perhaps, but also wonder and perhaps even relief. She had known his restlessness, his intensity, and now she saw it made manifest in a choice so extreme that it would define him forever. Thelma, by contrast, sought no crowns, no spectacles, no grand gestures. Her later years were spent in quieter rhythms, traveling occasionally, residing in comfortable homes, writing, remembering. She authored memoirs that offered glimpses of her life, though always with restraint, never with bitterness. In those pages, one hears the voice of a woman who accepted her past without resentment, who looked upon her role in Edward's life not as a wound to be hidden, but as a chapter to be acknowledged. She did not claim more than was hers, nor did she diminish what had been. She wrote with the calmness of one who understood that memory, however fragile, is the only crown most lives ever wear. Her reflections were not confined to Edward alone. She considered her childhood, her twinship with Gloria, her marriages, her friendships, the endless Atlantic crossings that had carried her between worlds. In these memories, there is a sense of longing, but not regret. She seemed to understand that her life had been shaped by currents larger than herself, currents of wealth, society, desire, and history, and that she had navigated them as best she could. Perhaps this is the ultimate form of wisdom, to see one's life not as a series of failures or triumphs, but as a river through which one has passed, carried forward by forces both chosen and unchosen. And yet, reflection is not always gentle. Memory can be both companion and tormentor, offering comfort one moment and sorrow the next. In the stillness of her later years, Thelma must have heard again the laughter of ballrooms, the clink of glasses, the soft sound of Edward's voice in the quiet of Fort Belvedere. These sounds, once vivid, return now as echoes, haunting in their distance. She may have sat by her window, the evening light fading, turning the pages of an old diary whose paper had grown brittle, whose ink had faded, and felt herself drawn back into moments that could never be reclaimed. There is a sweetness in such recollection, but there is also a sting, for to remember is to be reminded of what is gone. Her sister's scandals, too, lingered in her thoughts, not as wounds, but as reminders of the fragility of reputation. The Morgans had been thrust into the public gaze again and again, their lives dissected, their choices judged. And yet both sisters endured, each in her own way, each carrying forward despite the weight of judgment. Thelma's endurance was quieter, less dramatic, but no less remarkable. She lived not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to resilience, to the ability to remain poised even when the world had shifted irrevocably. In these years, Thelma also became a figure of curiosity, sought out by those who wished to glimpse the woman who had come before Wallace. Interviewers and acquaintances alike asked her to recount her memories, to reveal what it had been like to love a man who abandoned the throne for another. She obliged at times, but always with restraint, never indulging in scandal, never feeding the hunger for gossip. Perhaps she knew that history would never grant her the final word, that she would always be remembered in relation to another. Yet within herself, she seemed at peace with that truth. To be remembered at all, even as a shadow, is still to be part of the story. As the years stretched into the 1950s and 60s, her life grew quieter still. Friends passed away, society changed, the glitter of her youth was replaced by new faces, new scandals, new names that captured the public's imagination. Yet Thelma remained, her beauty softened but not erased by age, her composure intact. She walked more slowly, spoke more softly, but her presence was still felt by those who knew her. She had become, in a sense, a relic of another age, a living link to the world of the 1920s and 30s, a reminder of a time when love and monarchy had collided in ways that altered nations. And in the very quiet of her later years, she found a kind of grace that had eluded her in youth. No longer competing for affection, no longer moving through ballrooms filled with rivals, no longer scrutinized for her role in Edward's life, she was free to simply exist, to live with the memories she carried and the wisdom they had given her. It was not a life of brilliance, perhaps, not a life of great triumphs, but it was a life of endurance, of quiet dignity, of acceptance. The image we leave here is of Thelma, seated by a window, a diary open upon her lap. The pages are brittle, the ink faded, yet the words still carry meaning. Her fingers trace the lines gently, as though touching not paper but memory itself. Outside, the light fades, casting long shadows across the room, the kind of light that softens everything it touches. She closes the diary slowly, her eyes lingering on its cover, her lips curved in the faintest of smiles. The turning of brittle pages has ended for the night, but their echoes remain in the room, whispering of lives once lived in brilliance, now preserved only in recollection. The diary closes softly in Thelma's lap, the fragile pages pressed together as though to seal away their whispers. The room grows quiet, the fading light from the window casting the last warmth of day across her face. Yet outside the walls of her solitude, history continued to turn, and the figure she had once loved, once steadied, once soothed, had stepped onto a stage unlike any other. Edward, Prince of Wales, became Edward VIII, and in the span of months he transformed from heir to king to exile, abandoning a crown for the woman he had chosen. For Thelma, who had known both his restlessness and his hunger for intimacy, this act was not merely a political convulsion. It was the ultimate expression of the man she had known in private, magnified to the scale of empire. In December 1936, the Abdication was announced. The words were spoken with solemnity, yet behind them lay passion and rebellion. Edward relinquished his throne, the weight of centuries falling away from him, not in defeat but in choice. He renounced the crown for Wallis Simpson, the woman whose presence had grown during Thelma's absences, the rival who had displaced her. The world reacted with shock, with judgment, with fascination. But Thelma, seated far from the spectacle, must have heard those words with a unique echo, for she knew that it could have been otherwise. Had time and chance arranged themselves differently, it might have been her name entwined with his decision, her presence for whom the crown was laid aside. And yet perhaps she also knew that it could never have been her. Edward's devotion to Wallace was not the kind of devotion he had offered to Thelma. With her, he had sought serenity, escape, companionship. With Wallace, he sought something harsher, more demanding, a relationship that tested and consumed him. Thelma had steadied him. Wallace ruled him. In this difference lay the reason history remembers one and not the other. Still, to watch from a distance as a man she had once loved shook the monarchy for love of another must have stirred in her a tangle of emotions, sorrow, wonder, perhaps even a measure of admiration for the boldness of his act. What did she think as she read the headlines, as she heard the voices on radios speaking of abdication, of crisis, of exile? Did she recall the evenings at Fort Belvedere when Edward had leaned close, his voice soft, his laughter easy? Did she imagine that same voice now speaking words of renunciation, words that would echo for generations? Did she allow herself the thought that she had once been in his place, that for a time she had been the woman he turned to above all others? Or did she close her diary and simply accept that destiny had chosen differently, that her role had been to prepare him for the love that would define him, though it would erase her? The abdication, for all its grandeur, carried with it a loneliness Thelma may have understood better than most. To give up a throne is not only to give up duty, but to give up the place one occupies in history. Edward became the Duke of Windsor, a man without a country, a figure both admired and resented, defined forever by a choice that set him apart. In his exile, he lived a life of luxury, of travel, of companionship with Wallace, yet there was always a sense of displacement, a shadow of what might have been. Thelma, observing from afar, may have recognized in him the same paradox she had once seen in their private moments, the longing for intimacy and the inability to ever be fully satisfied by it. Their paths did not cross often after his marriage, but their memories remained intertwined. In her later writings, Thelma did not condemn him, nor did she express bitterness toward Wallace. She spoke of him with warmth, as though to acknowledge that their time together had been genuine, even if it had not endured. She seemed to understand that love is not diminished by its impermanence, that to have been loved at all is itself a form of immortality. Still, the thought must have lingered, unspoken but persistent. What if it had been her? What if she had not crossed the Atlantic, had not left space for another to move closer? What if the crown had been abandoned for her instead? We, looking back, cannot answer these questions, for history has already chosen its path. But we can imagine her reflections, the quiet moments when she considered what had been and what had not. Perhaps she saw in Edward's abdication not only the story of Wallace, but the shadow of her own absence, the echo of her own presence, a reminder that history is shaped as much by those who are displaced as by those who remain. Thelma's own life, by contrast, grew quieter, less consumed by passion, more defined by memory. She did not seek to rival Wallace in notoriety, nor did she attempt to claim a role in Edward's story beyond what was hers. She accepted her place as the woman before, the one who had been loved but not chosen, the one who had steadied a restless prince on his way to a decision that would alter nations. In that acceptance lay both dignity and sorrow, for to be remembered as the woman before is to be remembered only in shadow, yet still remembered nonetheless. The image that lingers is of a crown, not upon a head, not upon a velvet cushion, but resting faintly in darkness, its jewels catching only the smallest glint of light. It gleams not with triumph, but with memory, as though to remind us that crowns, like loves, can be set aside, their brilliance dimmed by choices of the heart. Thelma, gazing at that faint gleam from afar, knew that it was not hers to wear, yet she also knew that her life had brushed against it, that for a moment, however brief, she had stood close enough to feel its weight. And so we leave her here, seated once more in her quiet room, the diary closed upon her lap, the crown glimmering faintly in the distance, gleaming not for her but still within sight, a symbol of what had been touched and what had been lost. The crown gleams faintly in darkness, its jewels catching a stray glint of light before sinking back into shadow. That faint gleam, so close yet forever distant, is like memory itself, visible for an instant, then swallowed by obscurity. For Thelma, the years that followed Edward's abdication were years of such shadows, years in which her presence in the great narrative grew fainter as another figure's silhouette swelled to dominate the stage. Wallis Simpson, now Duchess of Windsor, became the name remembered, the face photographed, the scandal immortalized. And Thelma, once the woman whose stillness had soothed a restless prince, was pushed into the margins, recalled less as a person in her own right than as a prelude to another's story. This, perhaps, is the most quiet kind of loss, not the loss of love, nor of youth, nor even of health, but the loss of remembrance, the slow erasure by time of what was once vivid. Newspapers that had once whispered of Thelma's elegance now spoke only of Wallace. Friends who once described her as Edward's companion began to refer to her in the past tense, as though her presence had already dissolved into memory. Thelma herself must have felt this shift, must have known that history was not hers to command, that it would carry forward the names it chose and leave others behind. And yet she bore it without bitterness, for she had long understood that to live in the orbit of a prince is to live always in shadow, illuminated only by borrowed light. Her place in history, when mentioned at all, was as the woman before Wallace. That phrase, simple and cruel, reduced her life to a footnote, her individuality to a prelude. Yet behind that phrase was a whole existence, a childhood of transatlantic wanderings, a marriage into nobility, a secret affair that had once defined her days. How strange it must have been to live with the knowledge that what had felt so vast, so consuming, would be remembered only as a stepping stone to someone else's renown. Did she feel the sting of injustice, or did she simply sigh and accept that this is the way of memory, selective and ruthless, caring little for dignity? It is tempting for us, looking back, to mourn this erasure, and yet perhaps Thelma herself found freedom in it. To fade from history's spotlight is also to be released from its scrutiny. Wallace and Edward, bound together by their infamous choice, spent the rest of their lives under the gaze of the world, their every movement dissected, their exile both luxurious and suffocating. Thelma, by contrast, lived in quieter rooms, traveled without relentless attention, aged without the same glare of judgment. She was forgotten by many, but in being forgotten, she was also left in peace. There is a paradox here. The price of being remembered is often the loss of privacy, the loss of the ability to simply exist. Thelma, overshadowed, may have found in her obscurity a kind of gentleness that fame could never grant. Still, obscurity does not erase memory within oneself. In her private reflections, in the diaries she kept, in the letters she wrote, Thelma surely revisited the moments that had once defined her. Memory can be sharper than history, more insistent, less willing to yield. The shadows of time may blur the public's recollection, but within her the images must have remained. Edward's laughter in the garden, the quiet of Fort Belvedere's rooms, the sound of hoofbeats in Windsor woods, the clink of glasses at dinners where she had once been the focus of his gaze. These memories, though fading in the world, remained vivid within her, companions in her solitude. What then does it mean to be remembered only as a shadow? Is it truly loss, or is it simply transformation? Thelma's name, though faint, still lingers in the annals of history, whispered by those who recall that before Wallace there was another, a woman whose beauty and serenity captured a prince's heart. Perhaps this is enough. Perhaps to be remembered at all, even as a shadow, is better than to be forgotten entirely. And perhaps, in the quiet honesty of her later years, she knew that her life had mattered, not because it was remembered, but because it was lived. The years continued their slow erosion. The glittering world of the 1920s and 30s receded further into the past, replaced by new decades, new scandals, new names that captured the imagination. Thelma lived through them quietly, her presence known only to those close to her, her name rarely spoken beyond their circle. She grew older, her beauty softening, her elegance mellowing into grace. Photographs of her in later life reveal a woman whose features, though lined, retained their poise, whose eyes still carried the depth that had once captivated. She was no longer central, no longer celebrated, but she was still herself, intact in her dignity. And yet, even in fading, there is an echo. In certain corners of society, among those who remembered, her name would still be spoken softly, like a secret. She was the one before, they would say, the one who came first. Not in the tone of dismissal, but with a kind of wistfulness, as though to acknowledge that her presence, though overshadowed, had been real, and that without her, the story itself would not have unfolded as it did. Shadows, after all, are cast only where there is light, and Thelma's light, though dimmed, had once shone brightly enough to leave its trace. The image that remains is of a whisper, carried on air, a name spoken not loudly but softly, passed from one voice to another, never fully disappearing, never fully remembered. Thelma walks down a hallway in her later years, her footsteps quiet, her figure lit only by a lamp's glow. Behind her, the hall fades into shadow, and in those shadows her name lingers like an echo, faint but enduring, waiting for someone, somewhere to call it forth once more. Her footsteps fade into the shadowed hallway, the soft tap of leather soles dwindling until only silence remains. It is in such silence that the last chapters of life often unfold, not with spectacle, but with stillness, not with trumpets, but with the quiet ticking of clocks. For Thelma, whose youth had been marked by transatlantic crossings, glittering salons, and the intimacy of a prince, her final years were spent far from the glare of history, in rooms where the curtains were drawn against the noise of the world and where memory itself became the truest companion. By the time the 1960s turned into the 1970s, she was no longer the striking young woman who had captivated Edward with her serenity, nor the elegant Viscountess whose gowns shimmered beneath chandeliers. She was older now, her dark hair silvered, her once perfect features softened by the passing of time. Yet those who knew her still spoke of her beauty, for it had never rested merely in her face but in the composure with which she carried herself. Even in age, she possessed that same aura of calm, the quiet dignity that had defined her from the very beginning. The world around her had changed beyond recognition. The empire that Edward had once been destined to rule had shrunk. Colonies had claimed independence, and the weight of monarchy itself seemed different in an age of television and modernity. The names that filled newspapers were no longer hers or her sister's, but those of new figures, new scandals, new loves that captured fleeting attention. Thelma lived on the periphery, her name invoked occasionally in reminiscence, but more often forgotten, like a candle left unlit in a room that still smelled faintly of wax. Her final years were not marked by scandal or tragedy, but by quiet withdrawal. She lived in relative comfort, moving within a small circle of friends who remembered her not as the woman before Wallace, but simply as Thelma. They spoke with her, dined with her, shared in the reminiscences of a past world now gone. Sometimes, when asked, she would recount memories of Edward, though always with restraint, never with bitterness. She spoke of him warmly, as though the sharp pain of betrayal had long since been worn smooth by the erosion of time. For Thelma, to remember him was not to reopen a wound but to trace a scar, permanent but no longer raw. And yet, even as she grew older, she must have known that history had not chosen her. She had been written into the margins, overshadowed by another's name, her own reduced to a prelude. Did this knowledge weigh upon her in solitude, or did she accept it as the natural order of things? Perhaps both. For Thelma had always known that her life was bound to currents larger than herself, that she was never the one to command but the one to endure. To endure is its own kind of triumph, though it leaves few monuments. Her death came quietly in 1970 at the age of 66. There were no grand obituaries, no lavish commemorations. Her funeral was attended by those who loved her personally, not by crowds or cameras. It was a farewell without spectacle, a closing of curtains rather than the ringing down of a stage bell. She was laid to rest with the dignity she had carried all her life, her story closing in silence, even as the world hurried on to new distractions. There is something profoundly moving in this quietness. For a woman who once stood beside a man who could have ruled the world, to die without spectacle is to remind us of the fleeting nature of both power and passion. Thelma had lived a life at the edge of history, her name entwined with one of its most infamous love stories, yet in the end she departed as she had lived, poised, uncomplaining, serene. Perhaps this was her final gift, to show that even when history forgets, the dignity of one's own presence remains. What do we make of such an ending? Is it tragedy, to be overshadowed, to be forgotten? Or is it mercy, to slip away quietly, unburdened by the endless scrutiny that consumed the lives of Edward and Wallace? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Thelma was not immortalized in books and films, not woven into the myths of abdication, yet she was spared the suffocating weight of notoriety. She lived, she loved, she endured, and in the end she was allowed to rest. There is a peace in that, though it is the peace of silence rather than of applause. The image that remains is one of a candle extinguished. The flame, once steady, is gone, and in its place rises a faint curl of smoke, twisting upward into the still air. The smoke carries with it the scent of wax, lingering even after the light has disappeared. It drifts for a moment, visible against the dimness, before dissolving into invisibility. So too, Thelma's life, a presence once bright, now faded, leaving behind only the faintest trace, a memory lingering like smoke long after the flame has vanished. The smoke rises in a thin curl above the extinguished candle, its shape wavering, twisting upon itself before it dissolves into the still air. For a moment it lingers, fragile yet defiant, as though unwilling to accept that its light has ended. Then it vanishes, leaving behind only the faint scent of wax, a trace that reminds us of what was once bright. So too with Thelma Furness. Her story did not close with fanfare, nor with the weight of history pressing heavily upon it. It ended as so many lives do, in quietness, in obscurity, in the soft erosion of memory. And yet, even in that silence, questions remain, questions that time has not resolved, questions that linger like the faint smoke of a candle, long after it has gone out. Was she truly loved, or was she merely a comfort along the way? Did Edward, restless and searching, ever feel for her what he later declared for Wallace, that consuming devotion for which he abandoned a crown? Or was Thelma's role always that of a pause, a resting place, a quiet harbor before the storm of destiny swept him elsewhere? These questions cannot be answered, not by history, not by memory, not even, perhaps, by Thelma herself. For love, in all its forms, resists certainty. It is felt, it is lived, it is endured, but it is rarely understood fully, even by those who dwell within it. And yet to dismiss her as merely the woman before is to do her an injustice. For Thelma's life was not defined only by Edward, though history has chosen to remember her that way. She was a daughter of America, born into a family of contradictions, raised across oceans. She was a wife twice and a viscountess, moving with grace among the nobility of Britain. She was a sister, her life entwined with Gloria's scandals and sorrows. She was a socialite, admired in ballrooms and salons, remembered for her elegance and poise. And she was a woman who endured, who carried herself with dignity even when displaced, who did not crumble beneath betrayal or scandal, but moved forward with serenity. To be reduced to a footnote is cruel. To be remembered at all is rare. Perhaps the truth of her legacy lies somewhere between. There is also the question of her own heart. Did she long in her later years for the intimacy she once shared, or did she grow grateful for the peace that came with solitude? Did she look back upon Edward as the great love of her life, or as a chapter both cherished and regretted? We cannot know. What we do know is that she remembered him with kindness, even decades after the fact, that she chose to speak warmly rather than bitterly. This choice itself is revealing, for it suggests that she found within herself a measure of peace. To look back without hatred is a form of victory, even if it is a quiet one. Her story reminds us, too, of the way history selects its characters, Wallis Simpson is remembered because Edward abandoned his throne for her, but Thelma, whose presence steadied him in the years before, who offered him companionship without demand, who gave him respite when his burdens weighed heavily, was written into the shadows. Yet is it not often those in shadow who make possible the acts of those in light? Without Thelma, would Edward have been prepared for Wallace? Would he have moved so swiftly into that consuming attachment? Perhaps Thelma's role was to prepare the ground, to steady him enough so that he could take the leap she herself would never have asked of him. If so, then her place in history, though quiet, is not insignificant. We might ask, too, whether she desired such significance at all. Did she wish to be remembered as the woman for whom a king gave up his throne? Or did she prefer, in the end, the gentleness of fading from memory, the peace of being spared the endless scrutiny that haunted Edward and Wallace for the rest of their lives? History often confuses fame with triumph, obscurity with defeat, but perhaps Thelma understood what many do not, that to live quietly, to endure with grace, to remember without bitterness, is its own form of triumph. And so her story closes not with certainty but with ambiguity, not with answers but with questions that stir and unsettle. Was she loved as she wished to be loved? Was she remembered as she deserved to be remembered? Was her serenity a strength that sustained her, or a weakness that allowed others to eclipse her? These questions remain, unanswered, unresolved, and perhaps that is as it should be. For to leave a life entirely explained is to diminish its mystery, and Thelma's life was nothing if not a tapestry of mystery, woven with both light and shadow, presence and absence. The image we leave at the end is a simple one, a drawer, partly open, within which lies a letter unsent. The paper is yellowed at its edges, its ink faded but still legible, words written in a hand that trembles slightly. It speaks not of declarations, not of demands, but of thoughts, too delicate to be shared, too uncertain to be spoken aloud. The letter rests in silence, never posted, never answered, its presence both a testament to love and a confession of its fragility. And in that letter, unsent and unresolved, lies the essence of Thelma's life. A story lived fully, remembered faintly, and carried forward not in certainty, but in lingering wonder. The candle is gone, the smoke has vanished, the drawer is closed. Yet the scent of wax, the trace of ink, the whisper of her name remain, faint but enduring, like the memory of a song half forgotten, waiting for someone, somewhere to hum its melody again.